We're live. Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining Virtual ISKCON, where we like to talk about topical matters. Perhaps one of the most hotly debated matters at the moment is the role that Vaishnavis have to contribute to the Krishna consciousness movement. And one of the thought leaders in this space, Sharadiya Rasa, is joining us. Thank you for making the time, Sharadiya Rasa. Perhaps you would like to say a few words of introduction.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, thank you so much for inviting me to be a guest speaker on Virtual ISKCON. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very honored you called me a thought leader when it comes to the position and the contribution that Vaishnavis can make in ISKCON. I do see myself as someone that is concerned about Vaishnavis, the service opportunities they have, the inclusion of Vaishnavis, and also respecting and appreciating Vaishnavis. So it's something I have been grappling with, thinking about, and also, trying to help bring about a positive change, within our devotee community.
You strike me as someone who's very thoughtful about the promotion of Krishna consciousness to the current generation and what it's going to be like, how accessible it is for all kinds of people. Obviously, Vaishnavis make up 50% of the movement, at least, and they make up 50%, women make up 50% of the general population, at least. And so it's a very important issue. Srila Prabhupada was very welcoming, broad-minded, broad-hearted, and yet we see different attitudes, a whole spectrum of attitudes in the movement today. I wonder if you can give us a little bit of background as to how you came to Krishna consciousness, and in particular, how you encountered some of the messaging and some of the practices relating to the treatment of women without being deterred.
Thanks for asking, Prabhu. So I was raised in a Christian family, and from my mother's side of the family, they were missionaries. So they had come to South Africa many generations ago to share, Christianity, not with the local indigenous people, but with the European settlers that had come to South Africa. So I came from a very religious background, and I would say I had a very deep interest in religion since a very young age. And I was very enthusiastic about attending church, since I can basically remember. And my interest in religion and spirituality continued to grow. So as I became, I would say, a preteen, from the age of 11, 12, I started having more and more questions about God, about different religions, about hell, about, different, I would say, existential questions. So I attended various churches. I even went to Bible school with my parents as a child. And as a teenager, I kind of expanded my search, into as many churches as possible, because I, grew up in quite a conservative community, in a conservative society. It was just after, or a few years after apartheid had ended. There weren't so many options available to me. I could basically, go to a variety of churches. There were no like temples where we were, and there were mosques and there were synagogues, but I would, as a child, not really have access to those. But I really explored Christianity to its limits, in my specific environment. But I wasn't satisfied philosophically. I really was inspired by the example and the teachings of Jesus, but I didn't find a process of transformation within mainstream Christianity. So by the end of high school, I was exploring Buddhism, but I was never satisfied with Buddhism because of the lack of a conception of a personal God. And coming from a Christian background, I was completely convinced that God is a person, and he's someone that we have a relationship with. And I also explored a lot of New Age writings, but I was never satisfied because I didn't feel it had enough substance. So during my first year of university, I was still very much on a search for finding, I would say, not only the truth about our existence, but I was also wanting answers to end our suffering, because I was acutely aware of our individual and collective suffering, as humans, but also, I would just say, as living beings, on the planet. So I joined a Bhakti Yoga Society, which was run by devotees from ISKCON Cape Town. And that's how I got introduced to Krishna consciousness. I had many questions for the devotees. And because, they didn't have so much time for us, they were, at least an hour away. They recommended that I read Bhagavad Gita. So I read Bhagavad Gita, and I would say when I read Bhagavad Gita, it was like the sun came up for me. It was like the first time in my life, it was like everything is illuminated. I felt like, now I understand, why are we here? What is the goal of our existence? And also what I didn't find, I'm not saying it's not there, but what I didn't find in mainstream Christianity is that process. What is the process from where we are now to, actually transforming and becoming saintly, becoming self-realized. So I hope that was a brief but thorough enough summary of me coming to Krishna consciousness.
Yeah, thank you. And as someone, obviously educated and so on, when you encountered either attitudes or statements or practices that seem to exclude or discriminate against women, Vaishnavis, what was that experience like? And how did you, keep going despite?
Thanks for asking that question, Prabhu. So I think when I came to Krishna consciousness, I was really desperate for a form of transformative spirituality. And I have to add that it was, especially at that point in time, historically, it was very unconventional what I did, because I would say that all of my family members, all of my friends are family friends, my whole social circle are all Christian. And in South Africa, Christians in general condemn all other faiths. Like everyone else is considered to be, direct on the path to hell. So despite this, I really wanted to practice Krishna consciousness. And, coming from I would say, a more conservative background, and, coming from what I would say is a very patriarchal society still, I did experience that, especially within our temple community at that point in time, women were definitely regarded as second-class citizens. And women, there was definitely the idea that women, should, as they would always say, they should be seen, but they should not be heard, very much in the background, etc. But I would say I was so desperate to have this spiritual experience that I resolved within myself that if that is really what is needed, and if that is asked of me, I will do it. Although I I come from a family where for multiple generations the women have gone to university. I've had, my grandmother even was a lecturer at university, so I do come from that, almost I would say, lineage. When I got the message that you need to be subservient, you need to be unseen, you need to not have ambition, etc., etc., I actually accepted it to a great extent. It wasn't easy for me, it wasn't natural for me, but I actually accepted it. And when I read statements about women, where you've got the classic one, women are less intelligent, I would digest it in the sense of that, yes, the more I identify with being a woman, that might be true, but I'm identifying, with being a devotee. And because of that, I'm not taking it as an offense. But that, I would say, my perspective has changed over time, but I'll end there for now.
But it is a deal breaker for many women, and even for many men who have a broader view of women. I don't know if you have a view as to how you navigate that when you are introducing Krishna consciousness to people and they raise it.
So Prabhu, here's where it really started to change, for me, as a person. As I said, like, I come from a pretty conservative, traditional religious background. So even for me as an individual, if I had to conform, to this idea, of the women just being at the back, of the women being quiet, of the women just being in a position of serving others, I could probably do it as an individual. But I have to say that the longer time I spent in Krishna consciousness, the more it became clear that for many women coming to Krishna consciousness, that simply is not going to work. And we are creating barriers, by making this, not an option, but also, almost making it, mandating it as a fixed role. We are limiting the people we're going to reach. I remember, I think, two interesting experiences I had. The one is I had a partner when I first met the devotees. He was actually a very nice person, very sattvic, a little bit interested in Krishna consciousness, but unfortunately, the brahmacharis at the temple at that time were very radical. So they kept on preaching to him that, I am Maya and you should leave me and you should become a brahmachari, etc., which was very ironic because, I had actually brought him to the temple and I was, more into Krishna consciousness than he was. But anyway, so the devotees unfortunately kind of drove this nice man completely away from the devotee community. And because he told me that the devotees are too fanatical, etc., our relationship at some point ended because I was more inspired to continue Krishna consciousness. And then I remember having a conversation with this person again a couple of years later, because it was kind of family friends. And I remember him saying to me, "What has happened to you?" And I was kind of like taken aback, and I was like, "What do you mean?" And then he told me that you used to be very confident, you used to be very outspoken, you used to have a lot of ambition and drive. Like, what has happened to you? What have they done to you? And I found that very interesting. I found it a very interesting observation from his side that we think that if we come to Krishna consciousness, we think that people should flourish, people should become more of who they are, but obviously in an elevated sense. But we often see, and I think that is what he noticed in me, is that instead of the process enhancing who I am and enabling me to utilize that for Krishna's service, in many ways, not the process, but the culture and the social norms were really confining me, and almost like disconnecting me from who I really was, obviously not as a spirit soul, but who I was in terms of my psychophysical nature. So that was I remember that was really like a pivotal experience for me. I was like, hold on, something is happening, which is actually which is actually harmful, which is actually not wholesome. And if it's happening to me, it's probably also happening to more other women. So that was a crucial moment for me in understanding that we really need to rethink this.
And absolutely, I agree with you that Srila Prabhupada actually taught about empowerment, and he didn't even want managers being too much under the thumb of other managers. What to speak of, yes, humility is a prized idea for all Vaishnavas, but not the idea of playing small, or not the idea of losing one's confidence, losing one's zest. I'm always reminded of this Padma Puran quote that says, if you see the deity as stone, if you see the guru as an ordinary man, if you discriminate against a Vaishnava based on what order they're from or social class or whatever, that's a hellish mentality. And so certainly Lord Chaitanya's mood, Srila Prabhupada's mood, is to encourage all souls to realize their potential and serve in the Krishna consciousness movement. Now, you've kindly produced a slide deck that you're going to talk us through, looking at the different archetypes, different ways in which Vaishnavis, women, are portrayed in Vedic literature. Because I think, I don't want to steal your thunder here, but I think you're saying that there's often a very limited view of what role a woman could play or a Vaishnavi could play, and yet there are actually lots of templates that are there. So is this a good time? Did you want to say any more just by way of introducing it?
I think one more thing that I'll say, that it was a very interesting experience for me. I was, at some point in time, I was living in the UK, and I really enjoyed joining the Saturday evening Harinam in London, which is a very enlivening experience. And one of the devotees involved there with the Harinam, and also very much involved with Rath Yatra in the UK is Parashuram. He's really a legendary person. I think everyone should know him. He does immense service there. And I remember him always encouraging me to come on Harinam, to participate, etc. And I remember him once saying to me that if I was a young, intelligent, educated woman, I would not join ISKCON now. And I thought, coming from a man, who's like an older generation, I thought that was a very astute observation. And I asked him why. And then he said, because if you are a young, intelligent, capable woman, there's just no space for you. And I thought this is very telling, because I wouldn't consider the UK Yatra, the most conservative. I think it's one of the more progressive yatras, within ISKCON, definitely. But even there, he pointed out to me that what would attract an educated, intelligent, competent person. And then I have to admit, very, very little. So this inspired me, to start thinking more about, beyond the stereotypes, have we seen other women? And, if you kind of remove this lens of every woman has to just be a wife and every woman just has to be at the back and every woman just has to be submissive, and you start reading our scripture again, you realize actually a lot of time women are central characters. In Mahabharata, it's most of the time the woman that actually moves one scene to the next scene because of their agency, because of, the choices that they make. So this inspired me to think about it, and this also inspired me to start speaking about it and presenting about it, so that we can make ISKCON more attractive, we can make ISKCON more inclusive, and ultimately we can facilitate, devotees' growth and engagement much better. So I'm happy to progress to our presentation.
Yeah, well, I might also just, in response to what you said, as a father and a grandfather of daughter and granddaughters and so on, of course, I'm naturally thinking, how will they experience the Krishna consciousness movement? Will they be encouraged, or will they find it off-putting? I know when my daughter hit her teenage years, she got so excited about Krishna consciousness, she was bringing friends from school. And then it came to the inevitable, hey, how come the women are at the back? Well, how come the women aren't doing as much of the singing? And she found, what she hadn't questioned necessarily, because she hadn't necessarily thought about it any other way, was certainly a question on the minds of her school friends. And certainly, if I'm going to be a loving father, I'm not thinking, your entire destiny is to be someone's husband, and your entire potential in life is to raise children, and that's it. I naturally wanted to feel like she can become a fully enfranchised member of Srila Prabhupada's movement. That's what Srila Prabhupada offered. And who are we to take it back? And I'm happy she's doing that, and she's pursuing, her career and all kinds of things. All right, I'm bringing your slides up.
Thank you so much. All right, so I entitled the presentation "The Many Versions of Vedic Women," and then we're going to look at different archetypes we've seen within our Vaishnava scriptures and stories, but we're also going to look how that is reflected in ISKCON's idea of women and ISKCON's, I would say, idealization of women. I will at times give some modern day examples when it's appropriate, but for some of it, it's going to be a little bit challenging. But I do hope this is going to be interesting and at least thought-provoking for some of us. I'm going to move this slide. All right, so let's start off with. So the first one is the wonderful wife. And I think the classic example that we're all very familiar with is Devahuti. So we know that Devahuti was a princess, but she desired to marry Kardama Muni, who was a sage, and then she was willing to live a much more simpler life within the forest. And it is said that she attained perfection through serving her husband. So Prabhupada always has, very great appreciation for her. I'm just going to read a verse here from Srimad Bhagavatam, which is about Devahuti. Devahuti, as the wife of Kardama Muni, achieved an invaluable gift from her husband because she was very faithful to him. For a woman, the first principle of religion is to be faithful to her husband. If, fortunately, the husband is a great personality, then the combination is perfect, and the lives of both the wife and the husbands are at once fulfilled. So Prabhupada often called Devahuti the perfect woman, because he also said she had a good father, she had a good husband, and then, of course, she got the best son. Because she got the Supreme Personality himself in the form of Kapiladev as her son. So, we see the idea of the ideal wife in Devahuti. We can also think of the example of Sita Devi. We can also think of the example of Dhritarashtra's wife, Gandhari, all women that are known for the fact that they were serving their husband, for the fact that they, I would say, wholeheartedly gave themselves to their husbands. And that is also, especially for Devahuti, the way in which she reached perfection. We don't really, hear about Devahuti independently almost, pursuing her path of self-realization, but it's through her husband. So the key traits of these archetypes is we know that they're dharmic, we know that they're submissive, and we have this idea that they're content and they're pleasing. So I would say, like, for most men, that's probably what they think, the ideal woman should be.
Well, the traditionalists definitely, don't they? This is the only archetype that they think is valid. They might have also missed that Prabhupada does a big if in that little passage that you read about the qualifications of the husband to deserve a wife like this. And I remember there being passages about flying castles and, satisfying her in lots of different ways. So the husband is also the servant in this model.
Absolutely, Prabhu. And I think the interesting thing about this archetype is that we've got the princess, Devahuti is the princess, but then the princess, on the other hand, is responding to the sage, to this ideal man, So I think this is very important. And I think, I haven't done like a historical study of this, but I would say in the earlier stages of ISKCON, this was very much the idea of what every woman should be. But there wasn't as much emphasis on what every man should be, because as you correctly pointed out, Kodama Muni, although initially he continued practicing his austerities, etc., and his sacrifices, and she was assisting him, and we read in Bhagavatam that she became quite thin and emancipated because of all the austerities she was performing. We do know that then he was touched, by her sacrifice, and then he facilitated her enjoyment for many thousands of years in quite an opulent manner. So I find it interesting that in the early days of ISKCON, we've got so much emphasis on women being, wives. A lot of people were being, coerced into marriages. A lot of, people were told that, that's your goal, you need to get married. But then there was great expectation on the women, but not so much great expectation on the men. Like, how many lectures do we hear about, the ideal man and what a man should be, and, all the mistakes that men are making in ISKCON. So,
well, yeah, apologies. You go.
No, you can, please, Prabhu, feel free to add.
Well, a lot of people do this emphasis on Varnashram, and as you say, the Sri Dharma, the responsibilities of the wife, and so on. Yes. But Varnashram, as you're pointing out, is actually a system. So the point is, it works systemically as a whole. Everyone needs to play their part. It always bemuses me that those who are the protagonists or whatever, the ones who are always putting forward Varnashram, they seem to be preoccupied with the lady's role, and they're not, for instance, as focused on, what does sannyasi dharma look like, and is anybody living up to that, and so on. It seems to be largely a device to keep women submissive.
Exactly, but I think a key element in this story is that Devahuti actually chose a husband. She chose Kodama Muni, so she chose that life. It wasn't enforced upon her. It's not like, her father sat her down and said, like, you're a princess, but I have decided, you have to have, this, this kind of austere person as a husband, and he's got to be your guru. It was her decision. So it was authentic because it came from her heart. And then, of course, as you pointed out, it worked. And that's what Prabhupada also says, it worked because he was qualified. So I think, this is something that is, completely missed. And, we've got this dynamic here of the princess, as I said, and the very powerful man. But it only works if the man is really powerful. Because we see that in her case, he plays that role of the guru to her. But it's again because she wants that. She chose him and she wants it. So it was still her decision. She still had that agency. But if we have this archetype enforced upon people, in the modern day age, when it almost becomes mandated, we often see that women develop unhealthy codependency. They completely lose their sense of individuality. They lose their sense of any self-autonomy. So it becomes unhealthy, especially if the man, isn't really completely qualified. So I think this is something to consider. Like, do we have the psychology for this? Do we have the culture for this? Do we have the training for this? And do we have the people that are qualified for this? Because I would say every Vedic principle only works in the proper relationship.
Certainly, Srila Prabhupada didn't seem that he was trying to impose old Vedic ways on people from other cultures as an overnight, sort of insistent and dogmatically and so on. Yes, he certainly spoke fondly of Vedic principles, but he also seemed to be a very accommodating and compassionate person who fully understood, he was dealing with a culture for which a lot of these ideas are alien. One of the other things that actually has always bemused me is that when stressing Sri Dharma, and as you say, Devahuti is often the model that's held up, people even would suggest, public speaking, giving the Bhagavatam class, or, we might go as far as initiating. Well, that would be a breach of Sri Dharma. And I don't see any reason why. I don't know what they have in their mind is going on in the Bhagavatam class, but why is that a lack of chastity for a woman to speak her realizations about Krishna consciousness, or indeed infuse people in Krishna consciousness? Everything seems to be dragged down as if it's coming from an ignoble motivation.
Yeah, definitely, Prabhu. I think so. Just wanted to backtrack a little. One of the points that you made is that Srila Prabhupada, speaks with a lot of appreciation for Devahuti, but it's not necessarily that he's mandating this as a standard, for all of society. And it's interesting, in the purport, Prabhupada writes it more in a descriptive sense, like he describes what she was. The one thing that Prabhupada does point out is he says that she was content. She chose a husband, and although she was a princess, she was content, with the simple living experience, in the forest. So then he said that's an important principle for women to learn to be content. I would say, yes, sure, that's a lesson to learn. If you do choose your certain husband, you do choose, a person of a certain capacity to provide materially, and learning to be content is a good principle, for women. However, that doesn't mean that you should be content with abuse. That doesn't mean you should be content, by being, put down, etc. And then to your second point, you were saying that sometimes the group of devotees who really advocate strongly for Sri Dharma, they say that any activity that is basically not serving the husband is considered against, Sri Dharma, is almost considered ardharmic. And I think the problem is that they conflate, what we would consider just Dharma, and then also what we consider devotional service. So I think that's a big issue. Like giving Bhagavatam class, that's devotional service. And, if someone is qualified, to do so, they should do so. Just because someone is a woman doesn't mean they should give Bhagavatam class. But if they're qualified, and if devotees want to hear from them, then they should give class. So I think that is a challenge that we have here, like conflating Dharma with devotional service. And sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. and also conflating, social roles with devotional service. And again, sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. But I mean, as we progress, we'll even see even the idea that in Vedic culture no women ever spoke up, it's just unfound.
Yeah, completely. All right. Are we ready to move to our next one?
Yes, we're ready to move to the next one. Oh, one last point I wanted to make on this propose that I'm not saying that this relationship model cannot work. I was thinking of one Vaishnavi. She might not be that well known to everyone. Her name was Manarupa. She was married to Prahlad Das Adhikari. He's an astrologer in ISKCON. And Manarupa, I would say, and I'm sure her husband wouldn't mind me saying this, was very much like this ideal wife. Her spiritual master, Jayapataka Swami, even said that she was the perfect disciple. She was the perfect wife. She was the perfect mother. And she was really like embodying that classical form of chastity, always covering her head. She even, whenever her husband entered the temple room, would offer her obeisances to him, which was really like, astounding. But it was authentic. They had a very loving relationship. She chose, Prahlad Nishinga as a husband, and they very much had that relationship of him being the guru and the guide. But she was flourishing in that relationship. He's not like a controlling person. He's not like a dominating person. He really loved and cherished her. So that was a beautiful example. But again, you see, it was her decision. It's not like her spiritual master mandated it. I mean, it's not something that Jayapataka Maharaj like tells his disciples to do. And their husband was really qualified. So I'm not saying it cannot work, but I'm saying it needs to be a choice, and we need the proper relationship, for that principle to work. So yes,
Well,
we
Dharma
can.
is. Sorry, you finish.
No, Prabhu. If you wanna say something before we move on, please
Well,
do.
someone flourishing is probably a sign that they are properly situated in their constitutional position.
Exactly.
The Prabhupada actually translates Dharma somewhere as that which sustains one's existence. So if someone actually, by practicing their Dharma, is feeling properly situated and enthused and living the right life and so on, that's a very different symptom than if it looks like they're following a whole bunch of expectations under protest that someone has for them, and they're shrinking and becoming less than their full potential. That's a very different thing.
Exactly, and that really wasn't the case of with Manarupa. She was glowing. She was such a exalted person, and very much loved and very much cherished. And I would say that she's the example that yes, this can work, but it has to work in the right context. All right, so I think this is going to be interesting. I call this archetype the challenged women, and I think I want to challenge us to think differently about the life of Queen Kunti. Now, if we think about the life of Queen Kunti, I think we often just think about a queen, royalty and the mother of the Pandavas. It's all very glorious, and of course, she's very well known for her prayers in the Bhagavatam. But if we think more deeply about her life, we realize that she basically, got pregnant as a teenager, and she had a child, outside of wedlock, which is very unconventional, for the time. And also, after she had the child, as we know, she decided not to keep the child. So she basically, gave the child up for adoption. Well, she didn't even do that. She basically just, sent Karna down the river. And later in her life, even though she knew Karna was her son, she also, till a very late point, she didn't actually communicate that to others, and she didn't communicate it to him. And there might have been multiple reasons for it. Some of them being we can imagine, the social ostracization she might have experienced, if she actually, acknowledged Karna as a son. But if we look at her life further, we see that there is quite a lot of struggle in her life. She when the Pandavas are exiled, she's allowed to stay with Dhritarashtra, in the family in the palace. But you can imagine she is staying with family members that are very antagonistic towards her children, that have been trying to kill her children in so many ways. But what I find very interesting about Queen Kunti is that we see here an example of a woman that is independently pursuing her devotional service. Because Queen Kunti is not known for, being, although of course she was a wonderful wife, she lost her husband Pandu quite early, and she's not known for her devotion towards Pandu. She's not known for reaching perfection, because she was the ideal wife. She's known, for being a great devotee because she experienced so much tribulations, but she used those tribulations as opportunities to surrender. So I would say in her story, we see struggle, but we see purification, we see surrender, and we see realization. And I find it very interesting if we look at the history of ISKCON. I think that although initially, we had a big emphasis on women getting married and everyone needing to be a wife, etc., historically we see that a lot of the women really suffered. A lot of the women were in abusive relationships. A lot of the women were abandoned by their husbands. A lot of the women had to very much by themselves, often in antagonistic situations, look after their children and also pursue their devotional service independently, without the support or the guidance of the husbands. And if we look at the example of Queen Kunti, she's glorified. We don't have, passages in the Bhagavatam criticizing her for the fact that, she's not with her husband, criticizing her for the fact that she had a child out of wedlock. It is mentioned, but she's not criticized for it, which I think is very interesting. No, Prabhu, if you want to say anything at this point.
No, it's a good point. And in this day and age, yes, the amount of single parent families, but typically single mothers, is extraordinary. I think people underestimate what it takes to raise a child. I do think that, and this is true in secular society, women shoulder most of the burden anyway of raising children and even household type stuff. So there's a disproportionate share, even though many now are also contributing, to the overheads. In fact, it often takes two working adults now to at least to run a home. The other thing that the Kunti tale potentially raises, and we're seeing this, resurgence of people preaching child marriage, that, young girls, they should be married off even before puberty hits and so on. And there may have been a tradition of that going back a century or so in India. Maybe it's still going on in certain parts of India, but it's actually a terrifying thing to hear people in all earnestness advocating nowadays. I don't know if you've got any comments along those lines.
Again, Prabhu, I think it's another example of a Vedic principle, and the Vedic principle being arranging a girl's marriage at a young age so that there's a sense of stability and security, for her in the future, because the whole idea is then, as soon as she reaches puberty, she already knows who her husband is. So you're saving of the mental turbulation, of needing to find a partner and not knowing who is going to be, etc. But again, I would say it only works within a certain set of relationships and a certain culture. So in the culture where, we had, families who were really concerned about the well-being, of their daughters, then very carefully, trying to arrange a very suitable match, for them. And then everyone being socialized, to facilitate that. That's a very different situation. Now, if you're getting married, in that culture, you're also not marrying and then, living just in a nuclear family, like, a wife and a husband in an apartment somewhere. When you're married into an extended family. So when you're married to an extended family, there's also much more support, for you. There's a distribution of responsibilities, but there's also more, a spread of responsibilities in terms of you wouldn't need to facilitate all your partner's needs, and they don't need to facilitate all your needs, because the extended family is there. And because the extended family is there, there's also more support for the marriage itself. So I think in the current day and age, we can see that if we have, this promoted, we can see how it will very easily lead to extensive exploitation and taking advantage of those who are very vulnerable. So I think, again, it's like there's nothing wrong with the principle, but we have to ask ourselves, do we have the culture? Do we have the relationship? Do we have the social structure? And the answer is no, we don't. And I think that's why we see Prabhupada did not recommend this, for the same reason he also did not recommend polygamy, for the Western world, which again, in principle, isn't wrong. But you've got to ask yourself, when does it work, and when is it becoming, destructive?
And as you rightly pointed out, Queen Kunti, I mean, she has a series of lectures and a book. So there's a chapter devoted to her prayers in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So not only is she not regarded with criticism and so on, she's actually revered as one of the great souls who we have much to learn from.
Absolutely. And I think what this really shows, and I think this is what the advocates of Sri Dharma very strongly deny, that a woman can pursue self-realization by herself. Classic example, Queen Kunti, and no one criticizes her for failing to do her Dharma or failing to be a feminist, or being a feminist. It's, she is, as you said, she's glorified. So I think this is a very important point. Independently, she pursued devotional service and attained perfection. So, and she didn't have an ideal life at all. Her life was difficult, but by any form of judgment, her life was difficult, and also she definitely made social mistakes. So I find it very interesting, and I also find this idea of the single mother being problematic. I think that is, again, it's like historically it's unfound, because we've got a list of women in our culture who raised children by themselves. We've got Ulupi, one of the wives of Arjuna. She was a widow, so he married her after she was a widow. He had a child with her, and then he left. So Ulupi, raised a child, of course, not completely by herself, because she was, in the Naga kingdom with a family, but still, she was there. That the father wasn't there. We've got the same, we even have the same with these other wives, Chitraganda, where we'll speak about later as well. Again, like he married her, had a child with her, but then Arjuna left her, and she raised the child by herself. And it's interesting, we don't see a stigma attached to these women. When we read the stories, it's just described. It just happened. I mean, we can also look at Ambika and Ambalika. They also, again, single mothers, not single in the sense of having no family support, but single in the sense of the father isn't present. And again, we don't see in the stories that was seen as problematic, or that was like some ostracization, or they were excluded from society. It's just like, well, this is the situation, and then basically everyone goes on with life. So I find it very interesting that we have this problem, for instance, with single mothers.
In picking these as archetypes, the pushback, I could hear it even right now as we speak from some of the traditionalists. These are all amazing, great souls, unlike you, ordinary, low lives. That kind of contrast is often given, right? Well, of course, Janava Mata can be a guru because, she's Lord Nityananda's consort, but, you're all ordinary. And yet Prabhupada didn't refer to his disciples as ordinary women. He specifically said they're not ordinary women.
No. Yeah, I think, but also the thing is, we can say that, these women are extraordinary, but also the examples that are given, as the ideal wife, they're also extraordinary. Like, how many people are like Devahuti? How many people are like Sita Devi? So in every case, I mean, we just in general find the people in our Shastra to be extraordinary. That doesn't mean that we can't learn from them, and that doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge that the fact that they are there proves that we have a variety of people and a variety of women, and women playing a variety of roles who still practice devotional service. So I think, we're not saying that, we can do what they did, but we're saying the fact is they could practice Krishna consciousness gives us hope, and should also instruct us to be more inclusive in our ideas and our acceptance of, of women. in our devotee community.
Perfect.
Right. Okay, Prabhu. So we can move on to our next archetype. Can you maybe move the presentation on for me? I'm just struggling to find there we go. All right, so I think this is fascinating. We find so many examples of prostitutes in our scripture. And I mean, there's so many stories. I always struggle which one to pick, but I think the one I like the most is the story of Bivala Mangala Thakur, who we know was, raised in a Brahmana family, but then got attached to this prostitute called Chintamani. Interesting beginning to the story already. We can see that, her name even, is a devotional name. So he got, very attached to Chintamani, and it's explained that even on the day that his father, as far as funeral ceremony was happening and his father was being cremated, etc., he was completely consumed by his desire to go meet with Chintamani. So he decided to go, and he had to cross a river to, to get to her compound, and a storm broke out, and there was thunder and there was lightning, but he was completely determined to go meet Chintamani. So it's described that despite this raging storm, he jumped in the river and he was trying to swim through, and he almost drowned, and then he found something to grab on. He grabbed onto it. He thought it was a log. It turned out to be a dead body, but he didn't mind. He just held on to the dead body, got out of the river. It was struggling through the rain. You can just imagining it's mud and it's like, water gushing down. He got, to her residence. Chintamani had thought that because of the storm, clearly he wouldn't come. So she had locked the gates and she was, inside with her companions. So Bimala Mangla Thakur was like, banging on the door of the compound, shouting to her, but they heard some noise, but because of the storm raging, they didn't realize what it was. So he decided he's going to climb the wall. He started climbing the wall, and it was really a struggle. And at some point, he was almost falling, and he grabbed onto something to take hold of, and he grabbed what he thought was a vine, but it turned out to be a snake. But still, he continued. He got over the wall, but then he fell, and he actually fell himself unconscious, and there was a loud sound. So Chintamani and her companions that heard the sound, they were kind of shocked. They rushed out and they find Bivala Mangala Thakur passed out, there, on the ground. They take him inside and they nurse him back to health. And then I think, what is a very interesting turn, in the story is that she then says to him, if you had an ounce of the desire that you have to meet me, to meet Krishna, to meet God, you would have been a saint by now. And then this got this pivotal moment for Bibala Mangala Thakur. He realizes his mistake. And he decides, he's gonna go to Vrindavan. So what I find interesting, usually in the telling of the story, often in telling of the story, her name is excluded. Like she becomes like almost like a non-person, the prostitute. And also the vast majority of stories don't actually say anything about her, what happened to her. It just ends there for her. It's like, she served the purpose of helping Bibala Mangala Thakur, come to some realization, and then it stopped. But I did a lot of research, and then eventually I found one version of the story that actually then extends a little bit on her side, and then says she also then decided that she wants to change her occupation, and she herself also started, practicing devotional service with more seriousness. So I find this archetype fascinating because they pop up in so many places. We also have prostitute visiting Haridas Thakur. We also have Pingala, in the Bhagavatam. We also have prostitutes even in Dwarka. So it's not, it's not that it's not like prostitutes did not exist, in Vedic times. But it seems that we definitely have a struggle to accept it and to be comfortable with them. And if we look at these women, what I find interesting is they're very independent. They usually have their own place where they're living. In all the stories, they also make their own decisions. So they're kind of much more autonomous, than, a lot of the other women we find. And we also find that there is often this element of power, because most of the stories is like they've got some power over a man. And they're aware of that power, and they come as like yielding that power. Now, it would be inappropriate if I said like example X of the modern day prostitute says, but what I would suggest is that if we think about prostitution in a bit more an abstract manner, in the sense of like, in the sense, when you're a prostitute, you are giving something of yourself. You are giving something of yourself, but in a very transactional way. You want something, so you give something and you expect something in return. It's not like an unconditional romantic relationship. You're very clear from the beginning. It's a transaction. So it's interesting that Prabhupada said that, modern women, a lot of them are prostitutes. And I was thinking about this, and it's not necessarily even that, they're necessarily giving sex to people. But if you look at the principle, it's that exchange of energy. I want something, and then I'll give something, whether it's my time, whether it's my ideas, whether it's this, I'll give something, and then I'll get paid for it in return. And I think if we start thinking about, being a prostitute in that sense, it really changes the way we think about this archetype. And we see, in that sense, yes, many people in the modern age could be not only women, but also men are prostitutes. We're very transactional, in the way we are thinking. But at the same time, we see with this archetype, as I said, they've got more independence, they've got more autonomy, they do what they want to do, they basically direct their lives. And I think personally, after we've had in ISKCON, we've had this kind of mandated idea of women needing to be wives and submissive, etc. And then we went through a phase where a lot of women struggle. I would say that we're seeing a lot of this archetype now, where we've got people coming to ISKCON, but they're coming more on their terms and conditions. They're not willing, to just be at the back. They're not willing to just be submissive. They're much more, focused on their independence, on doing their thing. And if a situation is not working for them, they are willing to speak up about it. So I'm not saying like prostitutes in the sense of, offering sex to people for money, but I'm saying, more of an attitude of, being a bit more transactional and being, in a sense, more calculative, and a need for having that independence, and also being conscious of the power that they have. I know that's very unconventional, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts to offer.
No, I mean, I think when I think of the Chintamani story, again, she's not criticized, even though there might be implied she was doing a lowly profession. She's actually honored, and Biva Mangala honors her as a guru.
Yes.
That she got him on the path of Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada often spoke quite compassionately even about ladies of the night, in terms of that sometimes it was just that they'd fallen into this as a way of making a living, due to some unfortunate circumstance or whatever. And he also even talks about it being a valid occupation, because there will always be men who want to play away from home, so to speak. I do think that it's generally a pejorative term. It's often used that way in secular world as well. And I do think that some of the fanatical elements will brand all women as if they're a risk to a man's chastity. Cover your head. Meanwhile, he's prancing around with his top off, and and so on. And that double standard is not. I think you kind of summed it up earlier when you sort of made reference to women often don't even deserve a name; they're just a prop in a man's story, as opposed to, a sovereign entity in their own rights.
Yeah, and I think you made important points. One is that, of course, people, when we say like, prostitutes who are actually like in the profession, many of them, might be in that profession not out of choice, but due to circumstances, and we can have compassion for that. But then the second point is that in the scripture, we see that it is seen as a legitimate profession. So I'm saying that the principle of women being transactional saying I'm offering you something in terms of my energy for money is actually not frowned upon in scripture, because even in the sense where they're offering their bodies, it actually was accepted in Vedic society. So I do think you can make an argument, well, if it was accepted for women to offer their bodies for money, how can we now frown upon women just offering, their service in terms of their intellect, their
It does raise
contribution?
a question, given that women were honored so much in the Vedic age, where this sort of contemptuous attitude has come from. Whether that's actually some other cultural influence that came in at a particular time, or whether it's just that there will always be a particular class of men who want to subordinate women, and this becomes their, instinctive choice.
Yeah, I think that I mean that's a whole nother discussion. I mean, there's a whole school of thought that is arguing that in Vedic times women actually had enjoyed more freedom, more respect, more variety of positions, and it was with the invasion of the Mongols in India that there was really a shift, and we also see the emphasis on the covering of the body, etc. Because if you look at ancient Indian artworks, the women aren't particularly covered. On the contrary, very often the body is much more exposed, and the idea of the veil, etc., definitely seems to have come, from the Islamic influence. And then, of course, there was, later when the British ruled India, there was the influence of the Victorian values, which had very conservative ideas about, sexuality, and almost this idea that anything related to sexuality, is sinful and evil and dirty. And we don't really see that, in the Vedic literature. I think that's very much like a Victorian, idea, which does point out. I mean, I studied anthropology, so I know we can see that, we can observe this when we study any culture. Culture is not stagnant. Culture is moving, it's changing, it's always been influenced and influencing. So I think even if we say like Vedic culture, I would say a lot of the traditionalists seems to think that culture is something like just falls out of the sky, like a set block, and then it's like it's there. But culture is not like that. There's no observation of any culture that shows that culture is just a stagnant thing. My culture is dynamic, culture is evolving, and as I said, culture is always influencing and being influenced. So I do think it really challenges us to think about, if we say it's Vedic culture, okay, but where did this come from? Even though it might have been part of a certain part of Vedic culture, where did it come from? Where is the origin? Was it always like this? Was everyone always in agreement with this? Because we can say something's culture, but then we can also always ask, okay, but who in the culture has the power to ensure that this is continuing? And who in the culture, is actually resisting that this is continuing? Which is also another, I think, important question.
Just to continue my earlier thought as well, I mean, we know that the idea of transcending sex desire is, intrinsically part of Bhagavad philosophy. Obviously, the responsible dovetailing of that desire until one's ready to transcend. But it does seem like the neophyte reads these verses, maybe by Jamuna Acharya. Whenever I think of sex desire, my lips curl with distaste and I spit at the thought. And they came to associate, if I spit, not just at the thought of sex desire, but at the object of my sex desire, that will be a method of demonstrating just how detached I am. And so I think there's some real virtue signaling. Let me demonstrate how Vedic I am. Let me demonstrate how detached I am. I can be really mean to women because that shows that I'm not at all, under the charm of a woman. And so I do think it's men trying to impress other men. Much of the time, it's sort of a neophyte, way.
No, I think that's a very valid point, but there's a lot of, I think, virtue signal, and a lot of, I think, because we emphasize certain ideals, because we emphasize in ISKCON the wife, and we'll get to the next one, the mother, then often, people want to prove that they are that, and people also want to demonstrate that they are against anything else. So I think there is, I think there's a lot of virtue signal. There's a lot of, I think, also denial of who you really are. Instead of accepting who you are and accepting who others are, and just encouraging them, to practice, devotional service from that platform. And I think we have to admit it's not productive. Ultimately, it's not productive. Like, because you can only practice from where you are, and you can only practice as who you really are. And if you fail to do so, it's basically all just going to be a show. All right, so we've moved on to our next archetype. So this one, the selfless mother. I think obviously the classical example is Mother Yashoda, which is very much glorified. And interesting, Mother Yashoda, not so much glorified. Of course, she was a wonderful wife, but she's not glorified for being a wife. She's glorified for being Krishna's mother, which I think is another interesting meditation. Everything that we know about Mother Yashoda is in relationship to Krishna's mother, being Krishna's mother. And there's a very beautiful description of her when she is going to meet Krishna at Kurukshetra, when they go there for a lunar eclipse. So it's not during the war, but it's another time when Krishna is already an adult. And it's said that when she is coming to meet Krishna, her undergarment is soaked with milk, because she always relates to Krishna as a mother. That's always, like, no matter how old Krishna is, he's always her child. He's always a boy. She always wants to shower him with affection. So I think it's a beautiful archetype. There's there is the themes of giving, being very agreeable, and being very soft, being very sacrificing. And I think this is beautiful. And of course, if women weren't very agreeable and soft and sacrificing, they wouldn't be able to raise children. So this definitely is required. However, I do think in ISKCON we've had a little bit of an obsession, with this archetype for some time. And often, this again is forced upon women, like it's some template that all women, can perfectly fit into. And I think when this becomes unbalanced, we see the fact that women who are mothers, who are agreeable. So agreeable means that you are willing to adapt to others' needs. You are nice, essentially. You are putting yourself often, second. We see that this gets exploited to a great extent. We see that, women often neglect themselves. We see that they often almost like disconnect from their own needs. And we often see that they do burn out. So although this is wonderful, again, I think we need to be conscious, about how we advocate, women being mothers, and also how we relate to mothers. Someone should also consider, what is the mother's needs? Are they taken care of? Are they being heard? Are they being, are they actually being overly pleasing, where they're just accommodating, even things which are not beneficial for them, things that are harmful for them. So I do think, as I said, beautiful position, and always glorified in scripture. But when it comes to how we implement it, I think we've got to be a bit more conscious. Is there anything you would like to say, Your Prabhu?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, it is, as you say, one of the most noble honors and one of the most glorious roles. On the other hand, I think in our society, the term mother is used, almost sometimes weaponized. I remember seeing someone ask a question of a devotee giving class. It was a video clip. And he said something like mother, blah, blah, blah. And she said, "Oh, please don't call me that." And he then just quoted Chanaka Pandit at her, essentially dismissing her concern and just saying, "Look, I'm following a standard here, so I'm going to call you mother whether you like it or not." And so this debate, mother versus Prabhu, this has obviously, been going on for a while. Srila Prabhupada was quite happy to use them interchangeably. some obviously like to make it a polemic, mothers or masters. It's a male word, all of this kind of stuff. I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of that, why there would be so many of our devotee women who might take exception to being addressed as mother. What's behind that concern?
Sure, Prabhu. So I think we've got to admit that that the meanings of words change culturally, socially, historically. So if we look at the dictionary definition of mother, it's that, someone who has had a child, or someone who is, looking after a child. That is a mother. And if we look at the idea of calling women mother, the interesting thing in scripture is we don't have that. In scripture, women are addressed as Devi. They're dressed as goddess. Sometimes they also refer to as mother, but if you hear Bhagavatam, they always say Devi. So I find that interesting. So if we connect those two concepts of calling women mother and calling women Devi, the idea is that you should speak to a woman with a sense of reverence, because mother is the first guru. Mother is the one that actually gave you life. So mother is actually your authority, and mother is also someone that protects you. So if we look, from that sense, and I mean, I think the other element is that Prabhupada said that if you're a man, you should see a woman as mother, because the idea is that you don't exploit your mother, you respect your mother. Because again, she's, as I said, she's the guru. She actually provides for you, she nourishes you. So we understand that, and that's beautiful. And we see in many cultures that that's there. Women are called mother, although not young women. It would be more women senior in age. However, as I said, words change their meaning according to the social, historical, cultural context. And we see that in ISKCON, for a long time, when men called women mother, especially in certain communities, they did so in a way that was decondescending. They did so in a way as to point out the fact that you were, less intelligent, that you were insignificant, that you were supposed to be invisible. So, I mean, similar example in South Africa, we had a system of segregation, and what was called white people, in South Africa essentially ruled South Africa, and they discriminated against other people, and it was based on color. So we called African people black, and mixed race people were called colored. So now if you go look at the dictionary definition of black, it's dark. Calling a person black is not offensive. However, in South Africa, because of that history, today, I'm not allowed to call people black. If I do call people black, it's considered socially inappropriate. I've got to call people African because of the history. Now, when I went to the UK, I assumed it would be the same there. So I remember once commenting and asking someone, something about black people. They were highly offended. And they said that in the UK, calling someone, I called someone African. I called someone African because I thought that's the norm. And they were highly offended. And they said, no, in the UK, people prefer to be called Black British because African, was seen as like a name given to migrants, like poor Africans, etc. So you can see it's like two words. Like African just means a person from Africa. But in the UK, being called Africa is problematic. In South Africa, being called black is problematic. So we can see that words change meaning depending on the social context. So I think if you insist on calling someone Mataji, even though they have expressed to you that they're not comfortable with it, I think it is indicative that you're being impersonal. And again, not focusing on that relational aspect I mentioned earlier about a Vedic principle. The Vedic principle is you call them mother because you relate to them out of love and respect. But if someone now tells you that if you call me mother, I don't experience that you're relating to me out of love and respect, I do think it's good to have that sensitivity and ask them, what would you like me to call you? Or to, be genuinely curious and ask them, why does it bother you? Why does it bother you? it's not that you necessarily have an aversion to being a mother, but you might have an aversion, to being discriminated against, to being exploited, to being abused. Maybe that's what you have a problem with. So, but that was a bit of a long answer. It's a
No,
big
but it was
topic.
so beautifully explained. It was so well explained. And I'm hoping that, resources like this clip will be something that helps others think about navigating these things without getting so het up, and actually, being able to, as you say, relate to each other in a loving and inclusive way. So often there's a lot of weaponization that goes on around this issue. And
Absolutely.
it's the last thing that would please Prabhupada to see that.
Absolutely. And I think one last thing that I will say, and again, you can see it with the example of racial groups in South Africa, addressing someone in a certain way doesn't create a relationship. I can now in South Africa, I can now go around and call people African instead of black because politically that's the correct term. But if I'm a racist, I'll still be a racist.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to understand, just because you're calling someone mother is no proof that you are actually genuinely respecting them as mother, or seeing them as mother. So I think, it's very superficial. Like, I need to call you mother because, Chanaka Pandit said, you should relate to all women as mother. But are you really imbibing that mood? And if you imbibe that mood, could you not just imbibe that mood and call the person what they want to be called? So I think this, we need to consider, it's like changing a culture. It's not about changing names.
Absolutely. And, we have lots of other examples in many of the other mutts. They'll use Didi, sister, as a form of address. We know that Prabhupada's, his sister was generally called Pishima or auntie.
Yes.
So there's plenty of other, as you say, affectionate. And I think that's the main ingredient, right? There should be respect, but there should also be appropriate relational affection.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. And last thing I'll just say is that if you meditate upon us always being, the servant of others, I think we should really consider what is it that they need, not what we want to call them, but what is it that they need, and that is like the humble, service position.
Well, and I also think, like you're saying here, the risk is that someone who identifies as a mother, again, this is in secular society, often sacrifices their own needs for everybody else. And if we're really treating someone as our mother, we should actually be looking out to make sure she's not going without. That's what it's talking about.
Exactly. But that's why I said it's a beautiful archetype, but we've got to ask, like, isn't this person over-sacrificing? And because they are so agreeable, aren't we exploiting them? So, I do think we need to become more introspective. But now I think to move on to another archetype, which I think has, at the same time, while we have this selfless mother, archetype still being very strongly advocated in ISKCON by certain groups, we also have another one to look at. So the temptress, I think the most classic example we've got is Mohini Murti, of course, a form of Krishna herself. I think it's a very interesting story, part of the Bhagavatam, where the demons and the demigods have been churning the ocean of milk, and then at some point in time, there is a pot of nectar produced, but the demons succeed in stealing it. So then the plan that is devised to get the pot of nectar back is for Krishna to take this form as the most seductive woman, Mohini Murti. And then it's very interesting. The demons are so captivated by her beauty that they basically just agree, to whatever Mohini Murti wants. And she actually tells them that you shouldn't trust a woman, especially a woman like me. But, the godless said that they're so captured by her beauty that they just agree. So I just wanted to read 2 verses from this part of the Bhagavatam. It's in the 8th canto, I think 9th chapter. O king, since the demons had promised to accept whatever the woman did, whether just or unjust, now to keep this promise, to show their equilibrium, and to save themselves from fighting over woman, they remain silent. the demons had developed affection for Mohini Murti and a kind of faith in her, and they were afraid of disturbing their relationship. Therefore, they showed respect and honor to her words and did not say anything that might disturb their friendly relationship with her. So this was after Mohini Murti had gotten the pot of nectar from the demons, and then she tricked the demons. She acted like she was going to give some to them, but she didn't, and she gave all of the nectar to the demigods. And then we of course know Rahu realized what was happening, and he disguised himself as a demigod, and he also got some of the nectar, but then his head was served from his body for that. The pastimes in the Bhagavatam are always very, very colorful. So I find this a very fascinating archetype. We also have the same one in Urvasa, the heavenly lady who met Arjuna. Of course, the story there is slightly differently because she was attracted to Arjuna and she invited him to enjoy with her, but then he was reluctant to do so. He was even reluctant to look at her because he said that he considered her as a mother. So very interesting. I think this archetype has elements of, obviously, beauty is there. There's an element of enjoyment, but there's also a strong element of desire and distraction. So I think that no one would like to speak about this, but we're also definitely seeing more of women embodying this role as ISKCON is changing, and as ISKCON, I suppose, is more influenced by the external world, I would say. Because if we, for instance, looked at photos of Harinam in the 1960s, and we look at the way the women dressed at that point in time, the women would dress very simply. The women would often wear saris of one color, and also the women and the men were kind of together, in the group, and the women were just also partaking in the Harinam in general. And now we have a very interesting phenomena, which I would almost call the Russification of Harinams. And if you now Google like Hare Krishna Harinam and you put in women, usually what you'll see, is you'll see Harinam with ladies who are extensively decorated and who are doing some type of beautiful dances in a highly organized fashion, choreographed dancing, almost like entertaining. So I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm not making a moral judgment, but I'm making an observation that it's changed significantly. And I'm making the observation that there's a great emphasis on female beauty. There's a great emphasis on, being attractive, on being colorful. So I do think this is interesting. And if we take it a little bit further and we go down the dark well, which is social media, we see that even on especially Instagram, there seems to be a rapid increase of devotee women, using Instagram as this kind of a platform to essentially model themselves. And, often in devotional attire, but, in the past where we would have, you would go to the Dharma and then you would, take photos. So we've got like an event happens and then photos are taken. Now we've got an event created so photos can be taken. And we often have people posing posing in the Dharma and various holy places, and as I said, essentially modeling themselves. And this is a growing phenomenon. So I said, not passing a moral judgment, but I'm making an observation that this is happening, and I'm saying that I think we should consider why is this happening, and we should consider what is the potential effects of this happening, and we should also consider what are we valuing women for,
because do you have a view as to why it's happening?
Sorry, Prabhu?
Do you have a view as to why it's happening?
Why it's happening? Well, as I said, I think obviously it's not that this has only happened with the ISKCON. Like, I mean, if you look at Instagram, essentially is a platform for self-promotion, and for the vast majority of women, they would do so through, physical beauty. So I think that, it's happening in the wider world. So it will also happen within ISKCON. I do think a problem that we have in ISKCON is that we have failed to appreciate women as devotees, and we have failed to appreciate the contribution that women make as devotees. And because we have so much got hung up on, devotees in female bodies being women, the appreciation goes more for something as beauty, which of course is a sign of, previous piety. It's a sign of, having a certain level of consciousness. But that is not like a devotional activity you're appreciating someone for. But we see that when women display this sensuality, when they display this beauty, they do get simultaneously, they do get appreciation. Then of course there's the aversion side of it as well. So I do find it's very, very interesting. And as I said, no one wants to talk about it, but it is a reality. And I do think we have to also just have a conversation about, this is part of women. This is part of femininity, that, this temptress archetype, the temptress expression. But where is the appropriate expression for it? Where is the appropriate place for it? And are we giving the appropriate place for it, or are we potentially misusing it? So I think these are interesting questions to ask, because we also have a phenomena of young celibate men or older celibate men, being seen with like entourages of like very beautiful, attractive women, dancing in this way. So I think as a society, we need to ask questions about this. As I say, not judge it, because there's a difference, but I do think we need to start having questions about it and start having conversations and ask, where is this going?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valid observation. If I think about the Puranic tales, there's so many times when Shakuntala or Menaka or other temptresses came and deviated a sage from his meditation, and sometimes even, were sent by devas deliberately to distract someone from their meditation or whatever. And I think for the celibate class, they might have a very simplistic, either you're a sort of a safe mother who's, got kids and is a little older and, no longer has this sensual allure. Or if you're a young thing, that's walking around the temple somewhat scantily clad. I mean, we do have a dress code, but I think there are people who will absolutely still, demonstrate their allurement with every opportunity. And this is obviously the honey trap as far as the brahmacharis and the sannyasis are concerned. They would perhaps like to make all young women into the temptress as a way of saying, I need to be extraordinarily careful here, even though, as you're saying, there's an increasing trend now of people being a little bit more casual, surprisingly so.
I think, but I do think, Prabhu, there is a connection between failing to fully engage women. Failing, for instance, like how many places do we have where women get trained to give class, where women get trained to lead kirtan, where women get trained to preach? Very few. So I think we fail to give them engagement. And then this is the engagement that they go to, like extensive time spent on dressing up for Harinam. I'm not saying there's something wrong with it, but I think we've got to question, like, why is this happening? And why is this the thing that we appreciate women the most for currently? Being pretty. Nothing wrong with beauty and nothing wrong with engaging beauty in Krishna's service. But I mean, is that the only thing that Prabhupada wanted his female disciples to be? And I think that is, that is a big question.
Well, it's a big topic of debate. It is in the world generally. Is a woman's currency purely in her looks, and has she forfeited it as she ages? Which is why, marketeers are making an absolute mint out of things like the cosmetic industry or cosmetic surgery or gyms or other vanity pursuits.
Absolutely.
Do we want to create the same thing in our society? That's your desire when you're young and you have nothing to offer when you're old? That's a scary thought.
Exactly, because what is gonna happen to all these now young and beautiful women? They can't stay young and beautiful forever, and if that is what how they engage in service, if that's where they get appreciation, if that's the only training they get, how to be pretty, what's going to happen later? So I think that is one that's one element, and I think we've got to acknowledge that people come to Krishna consciousness from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of desires, and if someone was very strongly inclined to dress up and to be pretty and to dance and get attention, then obviously if they do so in Harinam, there'll be some purification, and with time, if they do so with some devotional intent as well, in time they'll become more purified, and the focus will be more on the actual service of chanting. But at the same time, as a movement, we've got to ask, what are we doing? And, what is the effect of us doing this? Just as we've had, and what many devotees will talk about, the Indianization of temples. And we're not saying it's wrong that many Indian people came to Krishna consciousness. It's wonderful. But we've got to ask, has that changed? Has that changed things culturally? And has it deviated things from the way that Srila Prabhupada wanted? So I think the same with this phenomenon. We've got to ask, has this changed Harinam? Has this changed the way we see women? And is it aligned or misaligned, with what Srila Prabhupada wanted for us?
Well, also, there's so much scorn that's often aimed at women because they can't even help themselves sometimes but be attractive. And they're blamed as if they did it to the men. It's not like the men have to get a handle on their desire or their ogling or these things. It's because the girl didn't dress demurely. It's because she laughed and she shouldn't have done that. That was unchaste. It's because, she didn't cover her head or whatever. So we see this with rape culture, right? The victim blaming.
Absolutely.
So there's something along these lines, I think, that simply happens where a girl suddenly has to take much more responsibility than perhaps she should, because men can't help but become lusty or something.
Absolutely. And I think, like, if we revisit the two examples that I gave, we've got Mohini Murti on the one hand, and she's successfully seduced the demons, and it's said in those verses because the demons were not very intelligent, they were just overcome by desire, etc. So they just yielded to it. So we can clearly see that is a weakness on the side of the demons. They were being controlled, but it's because they allowed themselves to be. They just yielded to it. But then if we look at the other example of Arjuna and Urvasi, he resisted the temptation. She was considered the most beautiful, woman in the heaven. And he had seen her dancing, and she came to him at night, scantily dressed, offering herself. But Arjuna, he took responsibility. He said, no, I see you as mother. I honor you as mother. I cannot enjoy you. So interesting. And interesting also, he didn't blame her. He addressed her respectfully, and even when she cursed him, was accepting, of the curse. So I think very interesting. We see an example of men being weak, and men just yielding to lust and desire, and then we see an example of a man choosing to be dharmic. So I think, yeah, it's a uncomfortable but an important discussion to have.
But necessary in this day and age, for sure. Thank you.
Yes. So I hope we still have enough time, Prabhu, because we've got 3 more. How are we doing for time?
Well, I imagine it's 10:15 where you are. I'm good.
Okay, we're good. Okay, so the witch. I also really like this one. I would say of all the archetypes we find, this is the most unconventional and the one which we have the most ostracization with. So a classic example of course, Putana. And I find the story of Putana very interesting, because we know that Putana in her previous life also had an encounter with Krishna as in the form of Vamanadev. And when she was in the court of Bali Maharaj, she saw Vamanadev, and initially when she saw him, she thought he was very beautiful, and she had this thought that she'd love to have him as a son, or have a son like him. But then, of course, after Vamanadev had misleaded Bali Maharaj and conquered him, she got angry, and she wanted to take some form of revenge. So in the next life, she becomes Putana, and interesting, she takes this form of a very beautiful woman, and I find it very fascinating that when she shows up in Vrindavan, she's accepted. She's welcomed. Within the community, and Mother Yashoda doesn't question her when she shows up at the house. She's just basically just like let into the house, although she's not known to the family. And then, she is also let into Krishna's bedroom, and she's allowed to pick up Krishna. So a lot of trust, again, because she was beautiful. And then it's explained that when she picks up Krishna and she looks at baby Krishna, there's a moment in which she thinks he is beautiful. I'd like to feed him. But of course, then we know she returns to her original intention, which was to kill him. And then we know, of course, Krishna kills her. And then what I find interesting is that usually when Krishna kills a demon, they just get liberation. But Putana not only just gets liberation, but she actually gets the position as a maidservant, like a nursemaid, someone that would again nurse Krishna. So I find it's a beautiful story, actually, of transformation. And you see a story of a devotee, and their devotional journey is very unconventional. Going from appreciating Krishna to wanting to revenge Krishna, to trying to kill Krishna, and then being liberated by Krishna and being allowed to serve Krishna in a very intimate way. So I find this is a fascinating story, not just for women, but I think for men as well. We can see people come to devotional service, and then initially we might have a certain impression of them. This is where the element of deception is. We have a certain impression of who they are, and they also portray themselves. But then after some time, we in the community might become aware that actually they have other intentions. They might want money, they might want fame, they might have an agenda. But I think the interesting thing is here that we see with Krishna, although Putana had an agenda, she wanted to kill him, he saw the essence. He saw that beneath that agenda to kill her, there was that moment in which she really wanted to have him as a baby and nurse him. And therefore, he reciprocated with that essence. So I think, here is a very important story of acknowledging, if people have ill motives, acknowledging if people have, hidden ambitions, ulterior motives, but at the same time having that faith that if they engage in devotional service, they will be transformed through Krishna. That there's always that possibility that Krishna will transform them. Do you have any thoughts, Prabhu?
One of the things I actually really like about the idea of archetypes is the idea of the hero's journey. Mm-hmm. And so often all cultures have these archetypes, right? And there's certain ones that you might start out in life as, and then there's certain ones that you might evolve into. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting with Putana, because I could imagine in the course of somebody's life, they could actually go through these different archetypes. They could be the innocent child, they could be the temptress, they could become the mother, they could become the old hag. All of those are possible.
Absolutely, Prabhu. And I think this is also that's why I said it's I think in our devotee community, we should not only expand our idea of what women could be, in the plural, but what a woman could be. I think that that's also very important. That one woman could go through different phases in her life, and in different places be different things. And I also think we've got to acknowledge that how we treat women is also going to influence on what they become, and how and how they act. So we see that, I mean, some empathy here for Putana, in her previous life, when she was Ratnamala. She was the daughter actually of Bani Maharaj. We can understand, like, from her perspective, that if someone came and he subjugated your father, that you could be upset, that you could want to revenge him. So it's interesting. It was like she did turn into a witch, but it was also because of the circumstances. Her father was humiliated right in front of her. She felt offended. Then she became a witch. So I think that's another important lesson here when we look at the archetypes. And it's a theme that will come up again later. It's like, why did this woman turn into this? I think that's an important question.
The other angle I really like with the archetypes is it actually invites men to consider what is the narrative that they have, the template that they have applied. Do they see all women as temptresses? Do they, even if they might call them mothers, do they see all women as witches? Oh, here come the feminists. They're all like Hillary Clinton. Goodness me.
Exactly.
And I think some of these are very, very powerful and enduring archetypes or narratives that are in people's heads. And this invites us to actually be a little bit more thoughtful about why we've adopted certain ways of seeing people.
Exactly. And I also think rethinking, like, even in ISKCON, the way we tell the stories, like the way the story that Putana is told, it's told that she gets liberated, but no one ever emphasizes the fact that she had an unconventional journey to her, like, Krishna consciousness, or the fact that she transformed. Like, that's not emphasized, or the fact that why she became a witch. So I think that's also another interesting element to it, is that how we are telling these stories, because the stories themselves, I would say are, they just kind of like telling the story, but then the way we tell the story and what we emphasize, that significantly influences how we're relating to the stories. Like, for instance, I've never heard anyone emphasize with Prahlad, I can't remember her name, the mother of Prahlad Maharaj, the wife of Hiranyakashipu. So, I mean, imagine the trauma she went through. She was kidnapped while she was pregnant, and the demons planned to, the demigods planned to kill her. And then they only kept her alive because, they were told that Prahlad, within a womb, was a saint. That's the only reason they kept her alive. And then afterwards, it's like, he's born and he's a devotee, and it's expressed that although she heard the teachings as well from Narada Muni, she didn't, become a saint. She just forgot them. But it's like, did anyone address the fact that she was, like, kidnapped and traumatized, and so I find that very interesting. It's like, how are we telling the stories? It's like, oh yeah, she was kidnapped. Oh, they wanted to kill her. But do we ever acknowledge, what that means and what it could have felt like for her, and the whole experience, and what is it, what are they, like, I would say, like, so many hidden lessons that we are missing. Thank you. Someone is saying her name was Kayadu. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Okay, Prabhu. So we continue.
Okay. So this is Draupadi, is it?
No, Prabhu. Actually, two other interesting characters. I would also classify Draupadi here, but yeah, I think this very interesting archetype, which is, I think, very much denied that it exists in ISKCON, and denies its existence as a part of reality, is the warrior process, the warrior princess. So actually, the first one that we've got there on the right is one of the wives of Arjuna, whom I mentioned earlier. So yeah, very interesting personality. She was the daughter of the king of Manipur, and the dynasty had, I suppose, some type of a curse that they were childless for for many generations. And then one of the personalities in the dynasty performed sacrifice and prayed to Lord Shiva, and then Lord Shiva appeared and he said that he will grant them that they will be able to have children, but only one child per generation. So, and in her case, she was the only child of her father, and because she was the only child, and because her father was conscious, of the fact that he won't have any others, he decided to raise her to be the ruler of the kingdom. So it said that he raised her in warfare. He trained her in politics, and he prepared her to be the next sovereign. So her name was Chitragada. So it said that during his time of exile, Arjuna went to Manipur, and it said that he met her, and he was actually, very fascinated by the fact that, she was this warrior princess. She had a lot of valor. She was very courageous, and he wanted to marry her. So he had one son with her, and then again, Arjuna actually left, and he returned to the other Pandavas, and they did unite later in life again. But at the point in the Mahabharata where the Pandavas are, on their last pilgrimage to the Himalayas, she actually returns back to her kingdom. So very interesting. I also find it interesting that we have other incidences in the Shrimad Bhagavatam, where the brahmanas in the community feel that the heir or the king, is not qualified, for that position, and then they actually get rid of the king. So it's we see that in Vedic culture. It's not that if there was a king that was unqualified, that nothing could be done. Steps were taken, but we see in her case that's not part of the story. We don't see some brahmanas cursing her to die because she's a woman and she can't be the ruler. So I find that very interesting. It was maybe not the norm, but still it was accepted that she was raised to be the ruler. Is there anything you would like to say at this point?
No, but I think that there are maybe increasingly, campaigners in our society for whom this would absolutely apply, where they're not wallflowers, they're not there just to pretty up a room and so on, but they're vigorously campaigning and so on. So it's absolutely a very, very valid, and I imagine more and more devotee women will take, guidance from this kind of archetype.
Yes, and I think, of course, this is not all women, but if you think about someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who was running in the US elections. I mean, I'm not saying she's a saint, but I'm saying you can see she's obviously a Kshatriya. I mean, she literally, went to war, and you can see that she's got a mission, and you can see that she also wants to protect people. You can see she's brave and she's courageous. You can see. And I mean, she's like a real life example. And we do know, although she's not affiliated with ISKCON, we do know she's a devotee. So I think, we're definitely seeing this is coming forth. And I think as women themselves in ISKCON are kind of breaking free from, the shackles of, this very limiting narrative, you can only be a wife and a mother. More are kind of like stepping into their character and using their abilities and their natures for service. I wanted to touch upon the other lady here. So we've got a depiction of the lady, famous lady in the Mahabharata, Amba, who was kidnapped by grandfather. It wasn't the grandfather at that stage, I suppose, by Bhishma Dev, and then who was very much offended and against the kidnapping because she had already wanted to marry someone else. Now I find it very interesting, with Amba, to summarize the story very, very shortly, she had already decided she wanted to marry another prince, and she was very disturbed by the fact that Bhishma Dev had kidnapped her. And when Bhishma Dev found out that she actually was very much opposed to marrying his brother, which he had kidnapped her and her two sisters for to be wives, he agreed that she goes back. So she did go back to her home, and she did go back to the prince she wanted to marry, but he then rejects her. So then, obviously this is very traumatic for her, and she goes to Bhishma and she says, "You've got to marry me." And we know that Bhishma has taken a vow of celibacy, so he refuses. There's a whole, even a battle between him and his guru and Parasham, and then in the end, like, neither can conquer the other. So she's basically left with no solution. She then performs austerities. Lord Shiva appears to her and he asks what she wants. She says she wants to get revenge. And then, in the next life, we know that she's born again as a woman, but then she becomes a man and she becomes Shikandi, and she's instrumental in killing Bhishmadev. So I think this is a very interesting story, because we see here what happens when a woman gets angry. Because so we definitely have this like warrior princess, but she's gotten angry, and now because of her anger, she's on this mission. So we can definitely see like a more destructive use of that, that fiery energy. But I think a question that often has been neglected is, why was she this angry? And we can see she was angry because she was offended. And, she was angry because she was disappointed. And we can even say, she was handled against her wishes, like like the course of her life was, redirected very much against the wishes. So I think this is a good question, for us to ask, because often from certain groups, we got, a lot of criticism against ladies, wanting to address injustices in ISKCON. They call them feminists, they call them feminazis, and, they call them prostitutes in a, but in a very, in a very critical way. And I think what they fail to ask is, but why are the women angry? What has upset them? Was there some injustice? What has happened? What do we need to restore? And instead of like attacking them, questioning what went wrong, and how can we fix it?
Well, and the whole Mahabharata conflict came about because of dishonoring of Draupadi and her desire for vengeance. And even though she forgave Ashvatthama very, compassionately or whatever, but, she was clearly deeply offended at what happened to her in the vicious assembly.
And see, there again, we see probably the result of offending a woman and the result of someone's anger. Because, I know you could argue many different things led to the actual, war of Kurukshetra, but sometimes it is said like the whole war happened because she was offended. So again, we see the implications of angering a woman, like this. Angering this, like, the Kshatriya ladies. It's like, Kshatriya ladies, but also who are, devotees of Krishna. We see this like vast rippling effect. So I think it's a good question to ask, instead of like, what should the women be doing? In ISKCON, we should be asking, why are the women upset? Why are they angry? What is disturbing them? And, rather ask those questions and then work towards a solution, rather than asking, how can we get them to listen? How can we get them to do this? How can we get them to submit? I do think we should change the questions that we are asking.
Well, I also think about this term protecting women. And so often it's used to sort of lock up your daughters type, mindset that women should be kept away from others and inhibited in some ways. And I actually think it's much more the opposite. It's that they feel absolutely revered and safe, and they're looked after, not looked after as if they're helpless dependents, but that they feel entirely safe.
Yeah, I think we have to we have to admit that if women feel safe, if they feel appreciated, if they feel nourished, then they are much more pleasant. It's when they feel neglected, when they feel exploited, when they feel that their needs have not been met, it's then that you get this other side. It's then that you get, the angry side, the difficult side. So I do think in the whole conversation in the whole conversation about needing to make women more Vedic and traditional, um, I think the focus. I mean, firstly, I think the focus should be on, if you want it to be more Vedic, I think, why not train up men? Why not start there? But if you wanted to ask questions about the women, I think you should ask, how can we make the women feel happy and safe and nourished and valuable? And then the rest of the issues will sort themselves out.
Yeah, very true. And of course, that makes an attractive movement. Again,
Absolutely.
not just for women, but for men. What to speak of also creating an environment where everybody's potential is realized and everyone's contribution is maximized, as opposed to 50% of the population feel disenfranchised and held back and excluded.
Absolutely, Prabhu. Yeah, absolutely. I think like it would be it would make such a big change if we all could start meditating upon what can I do to facilitate others' devotional service. What can I do to grow my own devotion, and how can I facilitate others? Which is very different from how can I prescribe others what they should be, and how can I, almost enforce. All right, but that's going to bring us to our last archetype for the day. So, the most controversial one currently in ISKCON, the teacher. So, most classic example that is most well known, in ISKCON is, of course, Janava Devi, the wife of Lord Nishananda, who we know, and which we don't disagree upon, at least after his departure, was considered the not only the guru, but really the caretaker, of the whole devotee community. And I think what is interesting about her is that Lord Nishananda had departed, so she was a widow, and we would even assume that a widow would have a very confined social existence. But in the case of Janava Devi, we see that she's taking a spiritual leadership position, and she's looking after the whole Vaishnava community. And we do know there's ample evidence that she did actually give diksha initiation, not only to ladies, but also. I think her example does illustrate how a woman can teacher, she can be a guru, and this does not go against upholding her chastity or her devotion to her husband. We know there is a famous pastime where Janama Mata encountered a group of Buddhists, and they challenged her, and I think they challenged her, and they said if she was really powerful, she had to display some type of mystical ability. She had to perform some type of miracle, and she sat down and she meditated on the lotus feet of Lord Nityananda. And then there was a tree who wasn't bearing any fruits because it wasn't the right season for the fruits. I think it was a mango tree. And then as she meditated, the fruit started bearing ripe the tree started bearing ripe fruit. And then the Buddhists were convinced, she was really empowered. So I find this a very interesting story. We see that simultaneously she took that leadership position because it was needed. And we simultaneously see that she did stay loyal and chaste to Lord Nityananda. So I think of all the archetypes, this is the archetype, for us as devotees. When you get to the stage where you can embody this, it's when you have transcended your identity as a woman, to a great extent. I think for most people, going through the other archetypes, still very much identifying with being a woman and channeling that energy in different ways. But the teacher, is someone that's actually kind of moved beyond it. And because they've moved beyond it, they've got the ability to teach others. And, we see with the ladies, and we won't get into that whole discussion now, but there's several other ladies in our tradition that have been Diksha Gurus. We see that it's not because they are a woman that it's like a petition that, there are so many male gurus, now we need a few female gurus. No, but it's because of their wisdom, which is not only knowledge, but realized knowledge, that it becomes clear that that's the position that they should be, serving in. And then we see that because they have, to a great extent transcended, identifying, with being a woman, they can really give protection to others. They can really give nourishment to others.
Yeah, to me, it's a no-brainer. I put a comment earlier when the professors O'Connell, so both Mr. and Mrs. O'Connell were professors, when they asked Prabhupada, can a woman become an acharya in your movement? This is the only time he's asked something like this point blank. So people can go after obscure, indirect references and purports. But here he's asked a direct question. Yes, why not? And then he quoted the Kiba Vipa Kiba Nyasi verse. Now, he only quoted the second half, but anyone who knows that it's half of that verse would actually understand the point is Prabhupada is making. Irrespective of where you sit in Varnashram, if you know the science of Krishna, you are a guru. To me, that's definitive. People may say, oh, yes, but Shastra trumps, conversations. Prabhupada's quoting Shastra. He's quoting Chaitanya Charitamrita. As far as he's concerned, this is the praman that says it doesn't matter what your situation in Varnashram, and he's including women in that, just by the virtue of that answer. To me, open and shut case. Yeah, and as you say, he also mentions Janava Mata as part of that conversation. It boggles the mind that people are still stuck on this when Srila Prabhupada has been so clear. Boggles the mind.
Yes, Prabhu. It definitely. It's definitely challenging, to understand. And I think, one of the core issues here is that there's a misunderstanding, for why there is a petition, essentially for Vaishnavis to be able to act as Diksha Gurus. Like not all, but a lot of the devotees who are opposing this, they are saying that it's a feminist agenda. Now, if you say feminism, it's kind of like very general because, there's so many different forms of feminism. At face value, okay, it's a feminist agenda. A feminist agenda would basically say that because you are a woman, you should be able to be a guru. We've got so many male gurus, and this is not right. There should be female gurus. But that's not the argument that is being made. Sorry, my throat's really drying up. The argument that's being made is that you are a spirit soul and you're not a woman. And therefore, if you're qualified, you should be able to act as guru. So it's like completely the opposite argument. The one is saying, because you're a woman, you should be entitled to. The other argument, which is the argument that the devotees that are for Vaishnava Diksha Gurus are making, is that you are not.
Looks like it's frozen a little bit there.
To be picked. Hare Krishna.
It froze a bit. I think you're back now.
You
were making the point that spirit souls, irrespective of the body they're housed in, should be acknowledged for their devotional adhikar, if I understood you right.
Yeah, I was just making the point that many of the devotees who are against Vaishnava Diksha Gurus are saying that it's a feminist agenda advocating for Vaishnavi Diksha gurus. But the feminist agenda would be, we've got so many men as gurus, and we need equal amount of women as gurus because we want equality. Because you're women, you should also be a guru. And I'm saying that the argument is exactly the opposite. The argument is, you're not a woman, you are a devotee. And the fact that you're a woman should not disqualify you from being a guru. So it's not feminism. It's the opposite of feminism. So,
agreed.
So I think, again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's a lot of a desire to control instead of a desire to understand and to seek how we can optimally facilitate, everyone's devotional service.
Well, thank you. I'm mindful we've just tipped over the 2-hour mark. This was a fantastic slideshow and a really wonderful way of having us think about the roles that these archetypes play. As I mentioned before, whether if you're in a woman's body, then there might be archetypes that you can take guidance and wisdom from. I think Carl Jung sort of used archetypes in that way, that many of us will look to the ancient tales and identify with one of the heroes and take some wisdom and guidance. And also, it's, I think, a very useful way of us examining what's my current paradigm. And is that helpful? Is that the way I want to treat other people, and so on? Did you have any words you wanted to say in closing, Smriti?
Yes, Prabhu. I'm struggling a bit. My throat's gone very dry, so I'm coughing. But I thought a nice way to end our discussion is to, as I said, change our meditation to how can we grow our devotion and how can we facilitate others' devotion. So I think if that becomes our meditation, then we'll become, much more personal in the way we deal with others. So there is a verse from the Bhagavatam by Prahlad Maharaj, which I really like, which I'd just like to read in closing. So Prahlad Maharaj prays, "May there be good fortune throughout the universe, and may all envious persons be pacified. May all living entities become calm by practicing bhakti yoga, for by accepting devotional service, they will think of each other's welfare. Therefore, let us all engage in the service of the Supreme Transcendence, Lord Shri Krishna, and always remain absorbed in thought of him." So I think that's a beautiful meditation, considering every devotee's welfare, and meditating how can we enhance their welfare. Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Massive thank you. That was a wonderful exposition that you gave, and I hope it actually helps lots of people who will, derive some guidance from it and so on. Please stay on so we can just debrief quickly. If you are watching, thank you very much for doing so. Please share it, and please let's make it an active comments thread as well. Hare Krishna.